Welcome to The Human Void. This video serves as an introduction to what will hopefully become a channel that inspires others to think a little more about life, the universe, humanity, or just to bathe in the existential dread that comes with constantly questioning life and questioning those questions. Let's get started, shall we? For a long time now, civilizations have always adhered to some degree of what's common, normal, or the way everyone else does it. But it's only been since the Industrial Revolution, more or less, when most of us started living in cities instead of farms, and when social norms and rules started to take shape so that we could live with each other in harmony, at least in theory, that we started to judge others based on certain, albeit unspoken, rules of the status quo, or what is supposed to be normal behavior. My rights end where yours begin. The origins of this quote, being heavily disputed on who actually came up with it, is basically the principle by which most of us live today, even if we aren't aware of this or never read this quote before. This, in theory, sounds great. It means that you can theoretically do what you want without judgment from others as long as you don't step on anyone's rights while doing it. Stepping on anyone's rights in this context could be as simple as your neighbor practicing his drums loudly at home while you're trying to sleep because you have to get to work tomorrow, ideally well slept. Your drummer neighbor in this case is violating your right to be well rested in order to be able to get to work in the first place and, actually work and be able to support yourself and or your family by actually doing your job and doing it well, which again circles back to the necessity of being well slept. This could be as extreme as thinking certain types of people are inferior or defective, be it because of their religious beliefs, ethnicity, or anything that is considered outside the status quo or not normal. There was a guy in Germany that rose to power in the mid-20th century that convinced a very large amount of people into these beliefs, achieving a socially justified genocide based on this principle. You might know who he is. Of course, we also have many other examples of extreme acts throughout history, even more recent ones, where many individuals in a group perpetrated extreme acts of prejudice and violence against those that are different, think differently, or once again are not normal. According to Wikipedia, normality based on social norms is when an individual's behaviors are guided by what they perceive to be society's expectations and their peers' norms. People measure the appropriateness of their actions by how far away they are from those social norms. However, what is perceived as a norm may or may not actually be the most common behavior. In some cases of pluralistic ignorance, most people wrongly believe the social norm is one thing, but in fact very few people hold that view. And when it comes to regulation of our personalities based on what normal is, the article also states, "It is harmony exists between a virtual identity of the self and a real social identity, whether it be in the form of a trait or attribute. If a person does not have this disharmony, then he or she is described as normal. A virtual identity can take many definitions, but in this case, a virtual identity is the identity that persons mentally create that conforms to societal standards and norms. It may not represent how they actually are, but it represents what they believe is a typical normal person." Now, getting the whole pseudo-intellectual drivel out of the way, what is normal? Why the heck do we judge others based on what normal is when most of us don't really know what it is? In fact, we can easily be convinced otherwise by seemingly charismatic people in positions of power, such as in politics, the media, and even your high school teacher or college professor. Even those that are more outspoken and know how to easily manipulate emotions of others can also convince anyone of their vision of what normal is supposed to be, especially with young and impressionable people. Think about all those times you like things or like to do things that were considered out of the norm by others, such as liking a specific type of fashion, of talking, having specific interests such as less mainstream music or films, having scientific interest in an otherwise scientifically illiterate area or family, maybe having totally different opinions on sexuality or anything in particular that made you different. Perhaps you were very energetic, or you were shy as a kid, or are particularly introverted now. All of these, of course, are not extremes and don't usually affect the lives of others negatively. I mean, hopefully you're not out there causing any harm on others in purpose. Hopefully. And now, think of all those times how you were seen by friends, family, co-workers, or even strangers as weird, as not normal. This wouldn't really be an issue if, for example, someone thinks you're strange, or you think that about someone else, but you don't go ahead and put it out there so the person or people you think are strange or weird hear it and possibly become offended. unless you mean to, of course. Because this doesn't really serve any beneficial purpose for you, and most definitely will not only not serve any purpose to the receiving person or people, but it could potentially affect someone else's self-esteem in a negative and unproductive way, which in some cases could get worse over time. Obviously, this happens because we let others do the thinking for us. Those that control culture control our minds, so to speak. So why the heck do we still think that we, in particular, know what normal is and judge others in our everyday lives based on this seemingly inexistent principle? Now, try to remember how many times you judge others because they didn't fit what is considered normal in your environment. Maybe you're in elementary school or a high school teacher and had a student that was energetic, who was witty and wanted to talk to everyone, and your first instinct is to make him or her to conform. Sit down, shut up, listen, and allow me to dictate the class the way I planned that in my head, damn it. Or maybe you've told the quiet kid to speak up and be more social when you didn't really know for sure why this happened, but you had to make sure the kid once again conformed and seemed normal. Best case scenario, your student brushes it off after a few times being told to conform and then tries to act like he or she should, like everyone else. Though they might have to fake it till they make it so as to not be bothered in the future with stupid questions. In a worst case scenario, that student will rebel even more, probably will have lower grades, might feel left out by one of the adults that is supposed to make them feel safe to be themselves and to learn. The student might feel like people they are supposed to look up to have failed them, and might eventually stop going to class altogether. This could of course affect their lives negatively and could potentially create a snowball effect of problems for them and potentially others involved in their lives too. Think of how many kids were unfairly labeled as troublemakers or weird, not just by other students but by teachers, potentially giving them a bad rep that they didn't ask for or needed. Now, let's say that perhaps you're a manager or a supervisor, say for example in an open office where you can see everyone and what they're up to at any time, but you have that one pesky employee that doesn't go to the optional work parties or after office get-togethers. Doesn't talk much except about the business at hand and professional matters with his or her co-workers, and is probably great at the job but doesn't care much about integrating with the rest of the team, but just getting the job done and going home. Nothing wrong with that, right? But you as a manager cannot stand to see someone who only comes to work to just work. They have to be a part of the team. Even though they do collaborate with the team, they might just not be into the whole lack of work-life balance that is so common in most modern jobs. Now, imagine yourself being in this employee's shoes, the person who has to endure someone else constantly telling them, "You do excellent work and I have no complaints, except you haven't been to any work parties or after-office gatherings, and so in this quarter, I will grade you as partially successful." That doesn't seem fair, right? You did all the work with flying colors, but you just don't care that much about making socials at work. If it wasn't obvious by now, this subject in particular is a pet peeve of mine and deserves its own video coming up soon. Now, getting back to this whole normality thing, this obsession with normality, even if one isn't aware of it, can at times be extremely damaging to societies and individuals integrating these societies. Sure, we all need to have some semblance of normality, familiarity, and ideally certain harmony. Life is, after all, a series of sacrifices. But remember that we are mainly talking about perceived social normality here, as there are many other types of normality out there. Luckily, this obsession with normality seems to be slowly changing, but there's still a lot of work to do in my humble opinion. Remember, there is no right or wrong way to be, so to speak, as long as you or the other person existing and being their merry selves doesn't step on anyone else's rights or causes harm in purpose. So what's the whole point of this video, I hear you ask? Well, the main point of this video and of this channel is to make people think a little more often in their everyday lives, to think about consequences of their actions and words, to make sure you don't leave the thinking to others all the time, to empathize with other human beings before judging, to listen, and to just let people be people. If you're interested in more, please join me in my pretentious quest to outthink everyone else and deconstruct the human condition.